Welcome to another episode of Legal for Tech, the podcast. So, guys, you do recognize my voice here. It's always Rosie, and as I've said many times, this is just a group of students and young professionals who are very interested in anything that has to do with technology and, yes, it's regulation. So, today I'm joined by my friend and colleague and producer, Giacomo Di Gregorio. Hi, Giacomo, great to see you.
Thank you, Rosie. So many names for me.
Yeah, you do too many things, it's true.
Nah.
Yes. And we are here calling from very cold Munich and very cold Brussels, all the way down to very cold Berlin to talk to our friend of the podcast and great guest, Michale Kolain. Hello, Michael. Great to see you.
Hey, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to actually get to talk to you. As I said, we have a bit of a connection. We are both in Germany right now. And I wanted to ask you, we've invited you on the show because you're very interested in the same topics that really we are passionate about. But how has your career developed? Why did you become interested in these topics? And where are you leading now?
Well, I studied law as you, and after law, it was around the time of the Edward Snowden cases, and I became very interested in the digital world and human rights issues. And back in these days, say 2015-ish for 2014, the topics were not so much discussed in the legal world. And just more or less by chance, I started working in one of the first research projects on digitalization and law in the German Research Institute of Public Administration. And yeah, we had all these interesting questions like algorithm regulation. Back then, it was not AI yet, platform regulation, data security, data protection. And I had the chance to work in this research project for quite some years and dive into many of these topics related. And then later, when a new government was formed in Germany, I applied for a job in the German parliament as a policy advisor. And during the last term, the so-called traffic light coalition, the Ampel coalition in Germany, I was advising one of the parliamentary groups as a legal advisor and had the chance to work actively on regulation. This was the time when many of the digital laws on the European end were negotiated and finished. And since the Ministry of Economy was run by the party that I was working for, I was like helping there in the German parliament. We also implemented some laws on digital administration and other topics. And then, unfortunately, this coalition didn't end well. And I also left my job, and now I'm working in civil society and as a also legal expert and writing studies and working more like a civil society perspective, activist, a bit journalistic. And yeah, that's how I got here.
And that's why we called you because your background is super interesting. So we wanted to ask you, since you mentioned that you have been working with the implementation of these EU regulations, what kind of regulations have you been working with? And also, how was the behavior of the politicians in the German parliament at that time? Was it easy for them to understand the regulations coming from Brussels and the implementation of them, or was it like mostly difficult to go through it?
Well, before I started, it was more a time where digital policy used to be very policy area. So it was more political scientists and people looking at the broad implications. And then when I got there, it was just the process when the European Commission, the European institutions started to putting all these ideas into law. So for me, it was very interesting. But also for the members of parliament, it was a bit different because before you more or less yeah, have some general ideas or ask the commission to do something about platform regulation, regulate social media, but it was not very specific. So when I started being in the German parliament, it was on the one side very interesting to look at the European institutions because for the party that I was working with, also, of course, there's members of parliament, the European Parliament, and they were negotiating these laws. And at the same time, we were also in touch with the German ministry who was responsible for negotiating in the council. So we had this interesting position of being in between those two worlds. And Concerning the members of parliament, they were very interested, but many of them are not lawyers in this field. I was working the Committee of Digital Affairs with some very experienced politicians, but also some of them just got elected into the parliament. So one person I was working with, Mike Ausendorf, he was the chairperson. He's a computer scientist, so he was very good about understanding the technical things, much better than me and others. But they also needed the advice on the laws because in the end, it's like, how do we change this sentence and what should be put in? Or they had some political ideas and said, but how do we formulate it into the law? So it was interesting to help them to translate their political demands into legal language. And at the same time, being in the parliament, let's say, I mean, the European laws were not discussed in the German parliament as legislation, but of course, we were discussing the development of them. But we had the implementing laws of the AI Act, of the Digital Governance Act, Data Act, and many of this, the political advertisement regulation, and we are following this in Brussels, but at the same time implementing some of these laws into German law. But then again, also digital affairs is like a very wide field. So we had also topics like e-health or patient files. And as our committee, we were always a bit co-responsible for those. So, and also many data protection issues come up in all kinds of fields. So we always had to look on these topics as well. And so the implementing act for the DSA was maybe my highlight, negotiating that because there was some freedom also of the on the German side to make some specifics. And also, we made a big reform law on digital administration and its digitalization, which was also a very big law that we worked on. And in Parliament, of course, you're the legislator, you can do anything you want, you can make all the changes, but the executive branch also feels somehow, well, we drafted the law, why do you want to make so many changes? So we also had this interesting negotiations with the people from the parliament who had drafted this law for a year with like 20 people. And then it's just like me and maybe one other lawyer and the members of parliament trying to negotiate with them what to include into the law. And the whole thing in a three-party coalition. So it was a very interesting role I had. It was more like in the background and more advisory, but I could really follow how politics and legislation works.
That's very interesting. I'm very curious about what you described as your highlight in terms of the DSA, because of course, it's particularly important right now if we think of the role that like social media platforms are playing in our lives, and especially in our politics, if you think about it. And I was wondering, let's say, in terms of who you were writing the law for, when you were thinking who is going to be the beneficiary of this law, who did you have in mind? Was it the people of Germany? Was it the businesses? Was it the platforms? Was it the users? Who was kind of occupying your thoughts for in terms of who would benefit from its implementation specifically?
Well, in a way, because I came from academia, I tried to have a look at all of those. But being part of this, I was part of the Green Party, advising the Green Party members. And traditionally, it's more the users that we have in mind, and the digital rights per se, and democracy as a whole, and a society to, well, just have a regulated environment for platforms. So for me, it was more the young girl who is harassed online and wants to fight for her rights. It was more small shop owners who want to do something against illegal products on big platforms. And but of course, you have to also deal from the perspective of the companies. But we had the Liberal Party who was very much taking care of that to have the business side of things. So we didn't have to worry about too much about that. And the ministries traditionally also have more the companies in mind. But for me, it was really more the individuals and the users and basically also society as a whole.
Um, Giacomo, do you want to ask a question?
No, no, I was just curious to know your perspective on something that is quite actual. So the basically the Grok scandal. Uh, that everyone knows about it right now, but just to explain for maybe some listeners, where the XAI chatbot generated non-consensual sexualized images of women and girls. Um, what does this incident reveal about the current gaps, like in AI governance, both in the EU AI Act and on platforms? What do you think about it?
I think it really shows, interestingly, how all of these laws are interconnected because they were thought more AI is a product. You have a product, maybe an app, which is a chatbot or something. But now we have AI integrated into a very large online platform. So how do you regulate it? It's not just an AI, but it's also more the platform. So what's in the foreground in these things? And interestingly, also because me coming from academia and having seen the draft and the background of these laws, it's interesting now to basically combine all of these areas. So you see from the AI Act, you can see, well, you have to make deep fakes transparent. You have to mark them as such. This is something that Grok is not doing per se. And like in the Grok app, some pictures are marked as AI generated with watermarks. But if you ask Grok on X to generate a picture of someone, there's no mark. You can just copy paste it. So we already have a breach here, basically. But then again, it only comes into force in summer. So we have like laws which are not implementing yet. And then we have the digital omnibus law coming up where they actually want to postpone the whole deadline for some more. And you feel like, well, if you postpone it more, also we will not be able to do anything against unmarked AI generated pictures. But then it's more like a DSA question, Digital Service Act question, because you have a platform which is basically not mitigating risks that it's meant to mitigate. So if you look at the DSA, which is, as you know, more like a structural law, it doesn't really, it more says you have to have structural measures against certain dangers and risks. And one of the risks, and it's even specifically in the DSA, is to prevent sexually, like gender-based crime. And it shouldn't enforce that. And what we see is it's just that. It's degrading women to a sexual object and infringing their personality rights and also like basically going to their dignity and exposing them in public. So you have this, but also, of course, it's a personality right. You don't want to be put into a context which is sexualized without your consent. And on top, you can also again look at it from a data protection angle and say, well, they are processing data which is very sensitive without the consent and without any, I would say, like obviously not legitimate basis. So we see the interplay of all these laws. And I think the most prominent way to go against it would be DSA because, well, they didn't mitigate the risks of integrating an AI into their platform. They just did it because they felt like it. But so that's where we are. And but being the DSA, it's a bit more abstract. You cannot say you don't find any obligation to not basically spread sexual violence, but you say you have to mitigate these risks, and then you have to look into the company and say, did they mitigate the risks? And did they make any plans? Did they have any measures against it? And then you can see the infringement. And I think something extra we see very new in the Grok scandal is that in the past we thought companies just follow existing laws. And if you tell them, well, this is against the law, they will have an own interest, like even a business interest, saving their reputation not to do it. But with X, we see now, let's say, a crazy tech billionaire who just doesn't care about the law and the state of law, and who's just doing it also to, yeah, basically attack the state of law in the European Union and the EU as such, out of business interests and out of right-wing ideology. So this is also a thing to consider that normally you would say, well, the procedures of the DSA lead to companies following the law, but what do you do if someone really plays like a cat and mouse game and says, well, let's see who's the strongest here? So we also see that enforcement is basically the key here. We have the rules, but in these cases, you need to enforce very fast because in the end, the victims are left alone. You cannot accept as a society to have these pictures online for months or years until the European Commission decides to put a fine or do any measures against it.
Yeah, this is a brilliant point, the one you made. A series of brilliant points. But first of all, I really find interesting your assessment of how things seem to have changed in terms of public opinion and how platform providers are interested in the public opinion. Although I would dispute that Meta has done exactly the same as X has done, because they have not completed a risk assessment under Article 34-35 of the DSA when they introduced Meta AI and Meta AI companions on Instagram and Facebook. So I would argue maybe it's not the crazy guy alone, it's the whole plethora of crazy guys. Since I guess this podcast is not going to go around Instagram or alike. But I would also like to point out, you said that you are now working more with civil society organizations. Um, in terms of people's voices, as you said, a investigation conducted by the Commission, enforcement by the European Commission can last years. We've seen what's happened exactly with X. On the former investigation conducted by the Commission, it took 3 years or something along the lines to actually have a product, to actually have an outcome. So, from the civil organization's perspective, what can be done to accelerate some processes? What can be done to help people find their voices and make them louder, considering that law can be slow? Even when we talk about private litigation, a trial before court on the basis of breach of the DSA or of the GDPR can take months, years. What can the civil society do to counter this problem?
I mean, one part that we also saw in the discussion is that the DSA also has this tool of temporary measures that they can do. So they can look at this and say, well, we cannot ban the whole platform. Like the process to ban a platform is a very long process. You have to have fines and you have investigations and maybe you have some legal disputes over it. And then after a very long process, this which can take months or years, a court has to decide over banning a whole platform. And this is also from digital civil society perspective problematic. We don't want to ban certain applications on the internet because it can be used, especially in authoritarian regimes, as a measure to really censor. But what the DSA also has is that alongside the investigations, in cases of very pressing violations and very strong violations of user rights, they can also implement these measures. And they could, for example, well, now X kind of took down this function also because of the pressure that came from civil society, from media, and so on. We still don't know. It was like it's all ongoing at the moment. But in this case, they could be the European Commission to tell them either take down Grok from your platform, or they could say make take off your AI generation mechanism in your AI, or they could say make it stop producing sexual violence pictures or like sexualized context pictures. So this would be something that the European Commission could do. I think they were in negotiations or talks with the platform. But we have these measures and it's possible, and we even have a blueprint for that. It's the case of TikTok Lite Rewards, which was in Spain. They implemented this reward program where basically kids even got some kind of coins if they stay on the platform, which was just an addictive design and basically like taken from online gambling to kids. So in this case, but also European Commission forced TikTok to take off this part of their platform. So there is this measure. I think but it's not based on the individual's rights. So the individuals should have the possibility to go against these things. We have a problem here, especially in Germany. We have the problem that criminal law is not suit fit for these cases. It's different in Italy. They introduced a law where the spreading of like these kind of pictures is banned. Also, UK is talking about it. Denmark is talking about copyright approaches to it. So we have all these different ways that individuals can maybe go against it, but also we know criminal investigations of online crimes is very slow. It's not really working yet, and it can take a long time. but there is these ways to go forward. Then we have class action possibilities. And also people can just basically tell, well, please delete the picture. And if they don't do it within a certain time, then the supervisory authorities, the digital services coordinator, can basically go against and say you're doing something structurally wrong. But things, of course, in this case, are still not fast. It's not tomorrow the picture is down and someone is punished. So we always have this kind of balancing out because we don't want just the executive branch to order platforms to delete something because we also have a right for information and many other things. But it's an interesting case to see how state of law procedures can be slow, and the discussion too, how can we basically be faster and more precise against these violations if we want to. But of course, I think there will be a fine at some point. There should be a fine against X for implementing this, but these measures just take very long, and then they go to the courts. Maybe the European Court of Justice finds some kind of violations, and of course, the European Commission doesn't want to risk that to at the end lose the case, and so on. But there is some ways, but still we need to kind of bundle it together and find these civil society organizations who are fighting for individuals' rights. Like where I'm working now, we're more an advocacy organization. We are making background information for journalists, and we're making more like political statements to these things. We are more like fact-based and giving background information. But there's also organizations like Hate Aid, which we have in Germany, who are helping victims of sexual crime. And interestingly, if I don't know if you and your listeners have heard that over Christmas, the two CEOs of Hate Aid were basically put on a sanction list of the United States government. So they are not allowed to enter the United States anymore. And in the next step, they could be even banned from using US American digital services just for helping women and young women and LGBTQ people and people who are just violated in the digital sphere. And for having an organization doing this and for being a trusted flagger, they have been hardly attacked by this new US government, which is basically having a love affair with big tech or the other way around, and just not doing anything and fighting even our attempt to regulate online platforms. And marking it as censorship, even though they want to censor the discourse, but kind of blaming us. It's an Orwellian situation, I would say. But you see, even those people who are fighting for the victims' rights are under huge attack. And we just expressed our solidarity with these two women who are very strong women and advocating for rights. But yeah, it's crazy times that we live in, and I think the measures in the DSA are existing, but we should a little bit enforce. We should enforce them much stronger in the future.
You said that there are measures, but sometimes it seems that regulators are a bit scared of enforcing them. Do you think that there is a role in the current EU and US relationship in the platform regulation? And probably I know the answer. Which role is it? What do you think is the impact that this relationship has? And also building up on this, if you think like the US relationship had a big impact in the proposal of the digital omnibus.
Well, for the first part of the question, I would say yes, it has a strong impact because the US has a big economic surplus in the European Union, and the European Union and all the member states are in a very problematic dependency on US service providers at the moment. We have, like, civil society organizations have said that for 30 years now. We had the summit on digital sovereignty in November, but still I don't see really the impact or like the even the awareness in some fields that this is a really large problem, and they can basically decide on how we use our infrastructures, and they can control our public discourse. And this is a large problem, and we see that also in this new government is using that in economic trade talks. So this is something also we wouldn't have expected in the past, that when you talk about trade talks, that someone would say, well, take away these laws because they're putting too much bureaucratic burden on us. And um, and I would like to point to also one big flaw of the Digital Services Act here. The Digital Services Act said that the supervisory authorities in the member states have to be independent from political pressure. And all of them have been set up in a way that's, for example, in Germany, the digital services coordinator cannot get any political. They cannot tell the minister cannot tell them, well, take this down or not, or make a fine. But on the European level, we don't have an independent unit to enforce the DSA. So in the end, it's the Commission, which on the one hand side is having economic talks about trade tariffs, and on the other hand side, they're responsible for enforcing our digital rights. And what we're seeing is that out of fear and of basically tariffs on German cars, they are not enforcing the DSA because they are fearing, oh, if we enforce the DSA, Donald Trump will get mad, and then all his tech bros will get mad, and then maybe we'll get tariffs on, I don't know, champagne and German, like Italian wine or German cars. And this is a big flaw because they are actually not doing what they're supposed to do, is to enforce the laws which are supposed to protect our rights.
That's brilliant. I I absolutely 100% agree with your statement. And I think it's particularly important right now to understand kind of how the Commission is moving, considering, for example, that I mean there is a threat of a invasion to a part of the European Union. So we need to take that into consideration when thinking of what the Commission is doing with the laws that we have as a civil society. Um, you mentioned something about criminal liability, which is something that I would say, in general, governments and legislator stir quite far away from. It's difficult to amend penal codes. It's difficult to create new kind of offenses, especially in Europe. Um, and when we think of the European Union in its whole, let's say that the European Union cannot obviously create new criminal offences. The criminal side is still very much a national level for how the devolution system works in the European Union. I'm speaking especially for our international listeners that maybe are not quite familiar with the European Union, how it's structured. Um, when you were working in the more political sphere, did you see that there were other sectors maybe that potentially politicians weren't very happy to regulate or to legislate upon? What was particularly difficult? We've seen, for example, that the AI Liability Directive hasn't gone through, whilst the AI Act has at the European level. Have you seen other things that potentially you thought, those would be good for civil society to regulate, but actually the politicians, the way that politics works, wouldn't have been kind of prone to regulating?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak about the digital policy field because that's where I was working. But I mean, we've seen a large propaganda campaign or like lobbying campaign of big tech against regulating them. And this is something new. I mean, came from since the Silicon Valley area, more or less. Like big companies like IBM, Siemens, General Motors, Mercedes-Benz, they're not against regulation per se. They know we are working in different regulatory environments, and there is a need for road safety or for trustworthiness. But here we see it from basically the first days of discussing these laws until the enforcement now that a propaganda machine, I can only say it like this because I think the lobby spendings of big tech is like as large as the automobile industry and the chemical industry combined, which are already the big players of even bigger than pharmaceuticals and so on. So they're using basically their money, their lobbyists, the really well-paid lawyers. I think some of our colleagues are working in this field and making good money with that. Some of the most brilliant minds are working there to help them. They have think tanks, they have fake academic institutions to work with. So we've seen it all the way through. And it's not just the material regulation of new rules, what they have to follow, but it's also the procedures that are implemented. We've seen it in data protection law because they're all in Ireland. All these big tech companies have their headquarters in Ireland. And the Irish Data Privacy Commissioner, basically now, which was elected, is an ex-Meta lobbyist. And they have not enforced these laws in Ireland. They made some changes to that, and this is thanks to many progressive or human rights centered members of parliament in the European Parliament. But also things like class action or collective action against these things. These are areas where I think we have many things that were missed out because we cannot put this only on the individual to fight for their rights. If you are exposed in such a violent and disgusting way in public sphere, you cannot pay for your court by yourself and go through this trauma again and again. So especially in this field of class action and giving more collective rights, I see a big problem. But the wider problem, as I said, is always that the whole public discourse about these topics and also the political discourse is dominated by narratives which come from the big tech companies to avoid regulation. And it's not in a blunt way. It's in a very sophisticated way that you first have to realize, oh, well, maybe regulation and innovation, these are not opposite sides, but they are, if you look at the car industry, there's always been regulation, and this made these products better and more safe and more reliable. And it was a market advantage for German cars to be highly regulated and for medical companies. But we've had these kind of narratives and fairy tales and you have like all these lobbies, they talk to the members of parliament, and then their associations talk, and then there's journalists who follow that. And it's very hard to stand up to that and to change the narrative. That's basically the organization I'm working with. The Center for Digital Rights and Democracy is what we're trying to do to challenge these big tech narratives from a democracy and human rights angle, and to be fast also because they also have the best PR people, they have the biggest media agencies who help them. So if something comes up, you are sure that thousands of people on the big tech side are already thinking, how do we sell that to the public? And on the other side, like on, let's say, our side where I'm working, we're just a few people who are not as well paid as all these corporate lawyers. And we still need to kind of, challenge that and communicate in a different way. And what we see is also this journalists are sometimes having this, we call it intellectual shame to talk about digital topics and about legal topics because they're always having this shame to maybe they're saying something which is technically not sound. And I myself are just experienced in this whole Grok conversation. I talked to many journalists, but they were not familiar with the DSA and its enforcement rules. So they had the inclination, well, there should be a way to ban it or forbid it or do something, but they didn't have the time and resources to really look into the law. So that's what I've been doing, like explaining people, well, there is ways to do it, and these are the ways that the DSA sees. But this is a struggle which is even now increasing because big tech is not just a huge lobby, but they also have the most powerful politicians in the world who have their back now. So the struggle is even more real and more difficult.
Um, it is true that the law is difficult to advertise if we read a legal text, and I'm quite familiar with the bigger bit, which is my nightmare on a nightly basis. I know that advertising, putting legal text in a form that people understand is difficult. However, these problems, these daily violations of our rights, do touch us very, very closely. And that's also because of the age of AI, the age of digital media, and so on. So, if you could just, in a nutshell, maybe present potentially three issues that you think people really need to take care of and focus on, because those will be the issues of tomorrow. And that's where regulation needs to go. And that's where we need to make sure that our laws prevail. What would these three issues be?
Well, I think one of the most pressing issues is not a new law, but it's enforcing the existing laws. We have many of these laws, and still people ask me, what should we do as a law to regulate platforms? I had this when ChatGPT came up. I was working in the German parliament, and many of the members of parliament came to me and said, well, we have to regulate AI now. What should we do? And I said, well, there is the AI Act. We have that, and it's just about to be implemented. You can call your colleagues in the European Parliament and or in the German ministries or whoever and tell them to implement your thoughts in it. And in many cases, like marking AI generated deepfakes, we already have rules in it. So first step is to say we have these rules, and it was a struggle to get to this point. I see it as a big empowerment struggle that we had in many human rights issues made by women's rights or LGBTQ rights or labor laws. We have basically the laws now, but now we need to enforce it. And for enforcing it, we need to have strong supervisory authorities, and they should attract the brilliant minds to work on their side instead of these large corporate law firms who are attracting them at the moment. It's something I find quite interesting if you follow Roger Brackman with Moral Ambition. He's describing this process that and I saw the same in my basically cohort. People go to university and they want to change the world, and then they study law, and at the end they go to, I don't know, McKinsey or one of these large platforms and make a lot of money. I feel like, where has this gone? Where is your moral ambition gone? So this is first of all enforcing, and we need interdisciplinary people. We need people like techies. We need lawyers. We need ethicists, and them working together. And I have the hope in this field because I've seen it that this cohort of people is coming now. We didn't have that 10 years ago, that people who know to write code and read the law. We have a lot of people in this now. So enforcement would be first. The second, I think, and this is something that the legislator has a bit missed and it's now getting visible, is the whole thing about AI companions. We're having this development, and I have it in my, you guys have it, and everybody who listens it. You have these friends who ask health advice to ChatGPT or who make like kind of therapeutical talks towards say like, oh, I'm feeling lonely. What should I do? Or even last week in a bar, a guy told me he automized a companion to make all his Tinder conversations and programmed it that when the other person agrees to date in a bar, then only he kind of goes into the chat. So we have these AI companions, but the problem is that in the negotiations of the AI Act, we left wide fields of these general LLMs, general purpose AI models, to like a softer regulation than the rest. And somehow the DSA covers it, but the AI doesn't cover it. But there is a big thing. And the third part, I would say, which we have to more focus, is to be smart about protecting young children and teenagers in the digital sphere. We have this very binary discussion about should we ban social media for everyone under 16? Or what should we do? And I think we need really new concepts to talk about protecting children and young people, enabling them, and somehow educating or helping them to find a healthy relationship to that. And I think there's a lot of things done because many times we talk about age verification at the end and say, okay, let's verify if someone is 16, but how do you do it with an AI recognizing your face with like putting all your personal data? Somehow we should have a protection for minors without killing the anonymity in the internet or pseudonymity in the internet and violating human rights. And we always have this discussion, like in chat control law, this that people come and say, well, we should breach encryption because we want to stop sexual abuse material to be spread on the internet. So I think this would be the third part.
I totally agree on the idea that AI chatbots need to be better looked at. And I have to be honest, I've been looking into it for a bit to understand what's really the deal with them. And it's scary. I really think the European Union needs to rethink of this. They're also embedded in like very, very popular platforms such as Instagram. And it's a vicious cycle. It's really a vicious cycle, something really to be careful about. Um, Thank you so much, Michael. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I hope we didn't steal too much of your time. This was such an incredible conversation. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for giving me the space to talk about my work, and thanks for the wonderful conversation.
Maybe if we can ask you one more time to tell our listeners the name of your project and the civil society organization you're working with.
Yes, it's Zentrum für Digitalrecht und Demokratie, in English, Center for Digital Rights and Democracy. And I'm also working with the Cyber Intelligence Institute. It's a research institute in Germany.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We will go follow the two institutes, and we definitely will put any link in the show notes so that our listeners can find them quite easily. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us. This was all from the Legal for Tech, the podcast.
This episode was brought to you in partnership with DG Beetle. DG Beetle helps privacy professionals to stay up to date with the most important European documents in the AI, data and digital space every day. Curious to know more? Check out the link in our show notes.